Distinguished participants, distinguished listeners, good afternoon. Cluster UNESCO Bureau is starting its seminar on cultural and creative industries. In the course of the webinars that are conducted in the framework of this series of webinars, we are analyzing various aspects of the development of creative industries jointly with the international experts who are the members of this work group on creative industries. We have already conducted several online presentations in the framework of this work. And if for whichever reason you have missed them out, there is a link that I have already sent to the chat box of Zoom to all our previous webinars. Additionally, we are recording our today's webinar. The recording is going to be saved as well, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Therefore, all the registered participants will additionally receive paper materials by mail. And to be able to see and to participate in our webinars in the social media, you will see the links in the chat through which you will be able to join us. Today, we are going to talk about the Creative Central Asia, the discussion and the transfer of the policy in the area of creative industries. And now today's speaker is Bodibaatar Jigjidsuren, who is the manager in the area of culture, and he's an expert on arts. And now he's an independent consultant on the issues related to culture. Our speaker is from Mongolia, and he used to work in the National Mongolian TV in the Ministry of Culture, and he is also an experienced teacher in the Mongolian University, and he was also consulting the majority party on the issues of culture and arts. He's also very much experienced in the creative industries as well as in the area of capacity building local professionals in the framework of 2005 Convention on the freedom of cultural self-expression. And he's got two degrees, bachelor degrees and two master's degrees in the area of history in the University of Ankara in Turkey, and the master's degree in the cultural policy. As you see, our today's guest is really has a very vast experience, both educational, professional, and cultural, and he's raised in the country, which is very similar to the culture of our Central Asian countries. And because we are sharing the same past, the same history, and we will be able also to establish some parallel links between the development of creative arts and in our countries. Therefore, with this, I would like to turn the floor now to Bodibaatar Jigjidsuren, who is going to share his screen. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk about these. So my title of my presentation is called "The Creative Central Asia and the Cultural and Creative Industry Discourse and Policy Transfer in Transitional Economies." So before we start, let me introduce about myself briefly. So I'm I used to work at the various governmental agencies, including the Ministry of Culture. So I'm a kind of a former, the boring bureaucrat, and at the same time also involved in academia. So I taught National University of Mongolia. So, and also I have this quasi-academic sort of experience. And also I advised and consulted for various the NGOs in the fields of cultural and creative sector, from the cultural, the jazz festival into international jazz festivals, also created international contemporary art exhibitions and so forth. And since 2019, I've been part of this member of this UNESCO 2005 Convention expert facility representing the Asia and Pacific region. So, and today I would like to outline and just lay out these sort of the historical context of these. I call it the transitional economies. So what does it mean economically, politically, and culturally? And then I would also like to emphasize on this. It's the transformation and its implications for cultural policy in the Central Asia and South Caucasus, as I consider as the transitional economy. So how these cultural policy reforms undertook, how liberalized, economicized, and also nationalized its cultural policies since the late 80s and early 90s, I would say. And also I would like to touch upon the rise and emergence of the cultural and creative industries and how it started and took off in the West, especially in the UK, in Europe, and then how it evolved and disseminated into these across the globe and through the international and intergovernmental agencies, including the British Council and UNESCO, and specifically in UNESCO's 2005 Convention, and what kind of role it has played in this global transfer of this cultural and creative industries policy agenda. And also, following that, I would like to explore how these transitional economies, including Mongolia, Central Asia, and South Caucasus, in these countries, adopted and implemented these kind of new cultural policy through, the British Council and UNESCO's in 2005 Convention. And in the end, I would like to raise some sort of, concerns or questions and question marks, I would say. So what are the current and maybe the remaining challenges that we're facing with, and then what are the future opportunities in the region? So these are basic sort of the outline of my webinar that I would like to deliver. All right, so let me start with the historicals of the context. So what does it mean, what I mean by this transition or the economic transition? So which means that it's from the planned economies into this market or free market economy. So in this centralized planned economy, everything production was owned by the government. So and then labor is regulated by the government, and also it has more or less this Politburo, and the centralized body was deciding with the help of planning once on the production of all commodities and also on prices, wages, and interest rates. And the prices played in this kind of planned economy system secondary role. And then since the late 80s and early 90s, we switched into this completely new kind of market economy system. So in this kind of new environment, political, economic environment, the factors of production are owned by private persons who are free in their economic decisions and the limits of their income and of the prices. And the prices are determined by the entrepreneurs rather than state, on the base of profit maximization, wage levels. So these are the basic sort of the underlining conceptual ideas of this market economy that we are switched into, transformed. So then the question would be how these political economic sort of transition or transformation and what is the implications for cultural policy in particular. So in this case, I would like to use these very widely used and well-known sort of the cultural policy models, and it's called the arm's length principle, which are developed by these Canadian cultural policy researchers. So they have these four or kind of the culture policy models they developed So it's called the facilitator state and the patron state, the architect state, and the engineer state models. So these are the sort of general kind of outlining the outlines of these four main sort of the cultural policy models. So in this facilitator model, which the researchers referred to the United States, the cultural and policy system. So areas of culture are funded indirectly, so by redistributing the taxes, so culture is in the hands of the private persons. So there's no any Minister of Culture, and that sort of state subsidy in the states. And then the next model is the Patron Model, which are the funding of culture is based on the arm's length principle through the councils of arts. And then the last two models are the architect and engineer ones. So culture is funded through the departments of culture or the ministry, and the state is the owner of the culture. So following that, this particular the culture policy model or the arm's length principles, the engineer state owns all the means of artistic production. So it supports only art that meets political standards of excellence, or the funding decisions are made by political commissars and are intended to further political education, not artistic excellence, which is the case in the UK in those the other the formats. And also the economic status of the artist is determined by membership in official party-approved artist unions. And anyone who doesn't belong to such a union is by definition not an artist. And all artistic enterprises are state-owned and operated, and that is all artistic means of production belong to the states. So this is the sort of general outline of this engineering model of this cultural policy. And the architect model is also close and to the previous engineering model, but there's slightly minor change. And then the architect state supports arts through its social welfare system with direct public funding, and the policy, the dynamic of the architect states tends to be revolutionary, and membership in artists union, and it has received the direct public funding. So all these, direct public funding helps artists to be immune from the box office dependence or the commercial side of the culture and affluence gap. So these are the based on these cultural policy models. So what were the socialist politics of culture? I mean, during this socialist period, or I would call the socialist politics of culture. So in this kind of era or political or economic system, so everything was politically sort of revolutionary and culturally proletarian and historically progressive. That was the main sort of vision for this socialist type of politics in the fields of culture. And culture was to be sort of operationalized, and its products would serve progress. And within this system, the revolutionary artists endorsed the criterion of social usefulness. So it was against the sort of bourgeoisie or these petit bourgeois idea, the arts for art's sake. So it was not only the arts in itself, the intrinsic value of art was not so important, but it is social role and social usefulness was playing a very crucial role within this sort of system. And it served the proletariat in the active building of a new kind of society. So it envisioned new human beings and new society within this system. And the tasks most pressing in culture were mass literacy, technical training, and political education, particularly for the majority and peasant classes for particular. So these were the main sort of the role and tasks of culture within this socialist politics, and culture was one of the main and crucial component within the system. But after the late 80s and 90s, after this transition, so still we have these stereotypical cultural bias or worldviews in the sphere of culture. So, for instance, in the West, artworks can be bought and sold in the art market as commodities. So, in the Western, in capitalistic the system, the arts and culture is very much commercialized. But whereas in the socialist societies, there was no art market, and the role of curators and the museum directors, all the people involved in these cultural professionals and practitioners, in fact, almost non-existent, because the only collector was the state. So there was no any sort of market for these arts and culture within the system. And the artist is understood as a professional in the West, including the curators and museum directors and collectors are the ultimate representation of the professional interests of the artists inside the art system. So this is the more or less the cultural and artistic field in the West. But in the socialist societies, and professional artists was a member of the Union of, at that time, it used to be called the Union of Soviet Artists. So the artist was understood to be a partner of the state and acted like a large corporation delivering its product to the state authorities. So there was no space for the market and commercialization in those areas. But that sort of, the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, these cultural bias and stereotypical ideas towards the arts and culture, and still these kind of still remains in this even after these transitions. So in the West, for instance, the artwork represent the aesthetic autonomy and then the freedom of art. These are the basic and the main criterion for the definition of artist and arts in Western in the Western countries. Whereas in the socialist countries, all the members of the union had to share certain kind of aesthetics, which are the collective, Soviet aesthetics, and artists were not supposed to create their own aesthetics, but to follow the hierarchy of the union. And based on these differences, socialist realism was denounced by the West as mere propaganda or as a political tool and ideology of the Communist Party. So in this regard, the West barely considered socialist realism in aesthetic terms, because it always dismissed socialist culture as kitsch or mere political propaganda without aesthetic value. So this is the still remaining issue and challenge in even in nowadays, and concerning the arts and culture in the transitional economies. And I'm also referring to this Boris Groys, and Boris Groys was one of the art theoretician and art historian who's trying to dismiss the widespread idea about the cultural and creative, cultural and then arts and cultural sector within the West and East, all this kind of conflictual environment. And artworks, no matter whether as a commodity or as a tool of political propaganda, should have equal rights to survive, to go down in art history, and to be produced and traded. So, and the amount of art produced under these two systems of art is roughly equal, but much more attention has been devoted to the history of art as commodity and much less to art as political propaganda. So all he's saying is that it is even within this, the globalized international environment that we live nowadays, and so we have to. There's still the culturally biased and conflictual ideas exist in the West and the East. So we have to, break these boundaries in order to conceive and then approach to arts and culture. So that, in that sense, Groys's these ideas is very crucial. That I'm thinking. So and after 90s and all these, the including Mongolia and Central Asia and then the former sort of the socialist countries, we entered into this new kind of political economic environment. So there was the heyday of the globalization. So everything was globalized. So I would like to refer this Also, there was one famous concepts development by the Arjun Appadurai, and he's called escapes. The global cultural economy was ubiquitous in this new globalized world. So everything was so, and even though in transitional economies, including Mongolia, the Western culture that we that were entering into the markets was very much embraced, but there was some sort of, I would not use like the word clash, but it was kind of contested. So there was kind of sort of the conflict between this Western commercial kind of culture versus the local the local culture. So Western culture was more or less commercial, materialist, superficial, entertainment, and about having fun. That was the main perception within the society, whereas local culture speaks directly to the soul and is spiritual and concerned with expression and meaning more than with commercial success. There was kind of this conception or some sort of the conflict between these two culture, even though the globalization was very much embraced by the society, and then there was the growing sort of the fear and then narrative, at least in Mongolian case, and then there's Mongolia is is a country, is a tiny country with there's only 3 million people. So because of these sort of anxieties and historical reasons, so there's kind of growing fear, and then under the name of cultural imperialism. So we have to, in this globalized world, we have to, protect our own sort of authentic and then spiritual culture. So that's also one of the concerns in Mongolia, and maybe in other transitional economies as well. So now I would like to talk about the emergence of the notion and the idea and concept of creative industries. So as an the idea and as a policy, it emerged in the late 90s, in 1998 to be precise, in the UK under the new Labour government, which was led by the Prime Minister at that time, the Tony Blair. And the basic idea was the intersection of the division between culture and economy. So they just tried to break down with these previous old ideas, they called the elitist ideas. So they just tried to rebrand the old ideas. So for instance, they just restructured and rebranded the previous Department of National Heritage into the Department of Culture, Media and Sports, DCMS we call it, and the digital also added in, if I'm not mistaken, in a bit late in around 2012. So what was the underlying ideas and concepts behind this, the policies and then these policy shifts, I would say. So the creative modernity, this is kind of these. So it envisioned kind of a new individualism where citizens are remade as creative entrepreneurs. So in the UK, in Europe, especially in Western Europe, and so these countries were facing with this deindustrialized, and so everything the politically and economically has to be retransformed. So that's what in that sort of the conjuncture, or in that sort of these particular time, period of time, the idea and the notion of creating industries emerged in the UK. And the orientation was not towards repetition and tradition, but towards change and favors the future over the past. So that was the main sort of the conceptual ideas behind this policy shift and change. And also the economics, the current existing economic models has to be, be reshaped and changed. So there was the new idea of new economy. So some people call the new economy the knowledge economy. So this economy was the complexities of the new economic world, new technologies and new financial instruments, a more integrated global economy, putting strains on the old regulatory stress. And so this is the definition of Joseph Stiglitz, or also one of the main economists in this globalized new economy, I would say. And also there was an emerging, the discourse taking place in that particular time period in the space, which were the new public management. So the basic idea was business and market-oriented and ideologies and policies and political programs intended to reduce the scale, scope, and fiscal appetite of governments. So that was the main sort of ideas behind this policy shift. So the newly established or restructured or rebranded the Department for Culture, Media and Sports in the UK. So they just came up with this new idea or the conception or the definition of the creative industries. So they just included the non sort of cultural industries within this definition, including the software and computer services, advertisement, and so forth. So these were the scale and scope of the creative industries in the late 90s, which emerged in the UK. And also at the same time in late 90s, and to be precise in 1998, also the new Labour government established a new National Endowment for Science, Technology and Arts. And the establishment and the organization also came up with these new definitions for the new emerging creative sectors. And since then, and also the other international and intergovernmental agencies, and also embraced and reconceptualized the idea of and policy of the cultural and creative industries. So there are, various types of the models of the cultural and creative industries. And so, to be short, there is no one size fits all kind of module or the model for these cultural and creative industries. So in the late 90s and early 2000s were the main the creativity moment, I would like to call it. So what was the conceptual, the background behind these, the cultural and creative industries policies? So I would like to, just collect all this creativity under the name of creativity dispositive. So it draws on such diverse phenomena as aesthetic subcultures, the artistic field, post-industrial labor, fashion, and experience-oriented conception and psychological discourses on human creativity, philosophical vitalism and developments in media technology, and also in urban level is cultural regeneration and political measures for fostering creative potential. So the creativity as an idea, as a concept, became this kind of a imperative, I would say, in the late 90s and 2000s. And it took off in various sort of, the spheres and fields of such as the creative economy. So everything just, these, they call the creative, so creative economy, creative industries, creative cities, creative hubs, and creative entrepreneurs, creative subjects, and creative class, and creative milieus and environments. So within this environment, they're working in fluid project teams across networks rather than institutions, and the entrepreneurs were were learning how to reinvent themselves in a more dynamic space outside the box of a formal job, picking up new skills and carrying out new opportunities in a transformed creative fields. And this was the main sort of environment for this creative milieu. And creative milieu was what were the semi-autonomous network embedded in particular urban places and through which new ideas emerge, circulate, mutate, and accelerate. And it fosters an economy of small businesses or startups, that we call it nowadays, entities operating in a zone between the hierarchical exclusive firm and looser social networks between competition and collaboration between the market and civil society. So these are the main sort of ecosystem for these creative milieus, and then for this new kind of emerging class and then ideas, I would say. And then one of the main author for this idea was the someone was called Richard Florida, and he wrote this very contested but very famous book, which is entitled The Rise of the Creative Classes. And within this book, he just sort of glorified and about these new emerging concepts such as the creative age, creative ethos, creative economy, the creative class, under the three main ideas, 3Ts, and technology, talent, and tolerance. So this was the main idea, and then also his ideas also embraced by these urban planners and policymakers across the globe, especially in the Western countries. And I would like to share some of these, these kind of creative milieus. And this is the picture from Ulaanbaatar, where there's a lot of creative hubs, and also based on these ideas. And then, all right. So now I would like to, from the idea, from the concept, and how this creativity evolved into this policy sphere or policy scape, I would like to, if you like. So this kind of the rhetoric of creative industry in the creative economy agenda were at national and local and international levels. So it just spread out across the globe, I would say, as a true enterprise economy for the 21st century. And it's, as I mentioned, it started in the late 90s, emerged in the late 90s in the Western Europe, and then it widespread through the international and international intergovernmental agencies, including the UNCTAD and UNESCO and the various international organizations such as the British Council, Alliance Française, and Goethe Institute, and so forth. And these new ideas emerged into Western countries, adopted and implemented in the global South or developing countries, in our case, in transitional economies. So this and the UNESCO 2005 convention, with its long title on the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions. So these are this is one of the binding agreement, international binding agreement on this. It has a very broad and broad the concepts concerning the cultural and creative industries, from the human rights into the intellectual property. So this is one of the main international binding agreement in the sphere of cultural and creative industries. And also UNESCO has its own different program for UNESCO creative cities, and then and also UNCTAD and also has this launched its creative economy program. Beg your pardon. And then it releases and relaunches it, and also publishes its reports and cultural and creative economy reports over the last few years. So this year, and also it was announced as an International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development. So as part of this initiative, the UNESCO Cluster Office in Almaty, Kazakhstan, is organizing this series of talks concerning the cultural and creative industries. So in transitional economies, including Mongolia, so what happened after these 90s, or how these new cultural reforms and new ideas, concepts, and policy agendas transferred in Mongolia and in other transitional economies. So, so what was the main idea was the globalization of the cultural and creative industries, and as I mentioned, the creativity dispositives. And what were the underpinning or underlining the ideas and concepts behind this transition was the modernization and political, economic, and structural reform it requires, such as governmentality and commercialization and open society. So within this, in order to flourish, in order to foster these cultural and creative industries, so these the transitional economies have to modernize its cultural policies and its political system and economic system, and its the management in its governance, and also it has to involve these various other actors, especially the actors from the civil society. So these were the underpinning or underlining main ideas behind this, the policy transfer. And what were the main keywords and main concepts of this transnational cultural policy transfer? And these were the cultural and creative industries, and creativity, and knowledge economy, or new economy they call it, and also the global flow of cultural goods and services, innovation, entrepreneurship, diversity, civil society, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, and bottom-up approach, inclusion, participation, sustainable development, and so forth. So these were the new sort of, it was a, to some extent, it was a totally kind of new concepts and ideas for these transitional economies. So we had, so these, including Mongolia, the transitional economies have had to adapt these new concepts in their own cultural policy reforms. And in this transnational cultural policy transfer, the main agencies and actors were, in the case of the transitional economies, it was the British Council and UNESCO, especially the UNESCO 2005 Convention that I mentioned. And the British Council, the initiated and established this Creative Central Asia initiative and network. And each year they're organizing this Central Asia Forum, this Creative Central Asia Forum in every other cities and countries. So what the main idea is to increase the creative enterprise and entrepreneurships skills amongst young people in Central Asia, and also promote the creative economy and engage with policymakers and private businesses in Central Asia. So I would like to share some of the images from this initiative. So since, if I'm not mistaken, it launched back in 2017. So in each year, and it's growing, and it's also influencing its cultural policy policy-scape within the region, I would say. And in the early 90s, and since the early 90s, and since this transition period, so I would like to share some of those, the experience that we had in our cultural policy reform in Mongolia. So these changes and experiences, might resonate, some resemblance in other transitional economies in Central Asia and South Caucasus, since we are sharing the common sort of historical trajectories over the last 70 or 80 years. So the idea was the adoption of the implementation of the discursive practices of cultural policy based on liberal principles, so such as cultural diversity, gender equality, participation and inclusion, civil society, creativity, and so forth. And also at the same time, there was also after the 90s especially, so there was in Mongolia, there was the emergence of the nationalism, there was the celebration, and then self-identity, cultural identity was one of the main discourse in that period. And still it hasn't very subject to political restrictions. And also the culture was also, it has these kind of, in a sense, the protectionist kind of approach towards cultural sphere, and then culture is defined in our policy document as a guarantee of independence and safety and source of national pride and unity and so forth. So the Mongolians also, at the same time, they embraced and then transformed all the liberal principles and ideas, including the cultural diversity and so forth. But at the same time, also there was a very cautious concerning towards these newly emerged the Western ideas and Western culture, I would say. So there was kind of a conflict between the global culture versus local culture in Mongolia. So and then there was kind of a lot of, the confusion and the bemusement took place in those, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, because of these newly emerging ideas and concepts, which were totally new for us. So there was a lot of uncertainties and inexperience in the field of cultural policy making throughout the 1990s and 2000s. So we're still facing with this weak cultural infrastructure and minimized public expenditure, insufficient subsidy, inadequate financial and employment management of cultural institutions. And also there's the mismanagement and ignorance of historic buildings and cultural institutions and so forth. And also because of this, and also we facing with this political instability, which has implications for the cultural policy as well. So there's a lack of long-term plans for the cultural and creative industries development, and the failure to develop a clear strategic vision for culture. And also in the even in the early and mid 90s, the shock therapy also had implications in the cultural sector. So there was this sudden unemployment of visual artists and the emergence of precarious freelance artistry and chaotic and unfair privatization of cultural buildings. So that was also one of the main challenges in those areas. And also we are facing with this bureaucratic complexity and rivalry at local and federal levels. So these are the remaining challenges in Mongolia. So, and Mongolia ratified to UNESCO 2005 convention in 2007. So what was the main sort of the rationales and economic, political rationales behind the ratification? So, so there was one of the main issue was the recognition of transitional economies regionally and internationally, so which has to do with this public diplomacy or soft power, and the pursuit of national building by cultural diversity and cultural identity, and diversifying its national economy through culture, because culture conceived as an industry. So this was also main ideas, and also the culture or creativity-led urban regeneration. So also this was the main idea for and also the inclusion and integration of national development and cultural policy reform, along with the social or public policy reforms. So these were the main sort of economical or urban or cultural or political sort of rationales behind the ratification, at least for Mongolia. And there was no any sort of, UNESCO didn't impose certain categorizations and conventions, but rather it was kind of a mutual collaboration or understanding between UNESCO and Mongolia. And now I would like to outline the main sort of three ideas behind the origins of the UNESCO 2005 convention. So there, first and foremost, there was the growing concerns about the increase in the global flows of trade in cultural good and creative and cultural and creative good and services, and its impact on local cultures. As I mentioned, that was the case in Mongolian. So I exemplified how these sort of conflict, or to some extent clash, took place in Mongolia versus the Western culture, Western globalized culture versus local culture. So that was the main sort of concern across the globe, and then especially the countries like France and Canada was trying to push this agenda in order to create and establish such an international binding agreement towards this globalized cultural economy. And secondly, there was the push or the conviction by the policymakers and developmental theorists and civil sector actors to expand the notion of development to include culture. So culture was not part of this developmental discourse. So, and these, the certain people, theorists and policymakers, there was the consensus among the people to include culture within this, the discourse concerning and surrounding the development. So that was the second sort of the idea behind the integration, to use the culture to broaden development out beyond the GDP indicators. So not the economic value of culture. So the non-economic values of culture was also very crucial and component within this developmental discourse. And the third concern was the growing recognition of culture as an economic sector, and this, that I mentioned early on about on the case of the UK. So the culture considered as not only in the entertainment or the heritage, it also became part of the economic ecosystem. So it considered as an economy in the industry. So that was also one of the main, the biggest reasons behind the convention. So now I would like to briefly just outline the 2000 UNESCO 2005 convention. So this is the, as I mentioned, the legally binding international agreements. So far there's 146 countries ratified to this convention, and the convention reaffirms the right to adopt policies and measures to support the emergence of dynamic and strong cultural and creative industries. And also the convention ensures artists and culture professionals and practitioners and citizens worldwide can create, produce, disseminate, and enjoy a broad range of cultural goods, services, and activities. So also at the same time, it reinforces organizational structures that have a direct impact on different stages of the cultural value. And our region and Asia Pacific is also very represented within the convention. So these are the countries from the Asia Pacific region that already ratified the convention. And the convention has its four main goals. The first goal is support sustainable systems of governance for culture, and the second is achieve a balanced flow of culture goods and services and increase the mobility of artists and cultural professionals. And third is the integrate culture in sustainable development frameworks. And the fourth is the promote human rights and fundamental freedoms. So these are the main four guiding principles of our convention. So the first, the goal is supporting the sustainable systems of governance for culture. So these policies must be, cultural policies must be transparent, which means that it has to involve the various and all the relevant stakeholders, especially from those for those who represent the civil society. So, and then this cultural policy has to be participatory by engaging all these, the relevant stakeholders, including the members of civil society. And also it has to inform through the regular collection of evidence and data to support future policies. So it has to be these based on the the evidence-based policy making. And the second goal is to achieve the balanced flow of cultural goods and services. So within this, so creative professionals and artists can travel freely, and also especially the developed countries countries has to show some preferential treatments for the developing countries. So there has to be collaboration between the global north and global south, as well as the global south and global south. So these are the main ideas behind this, the collaboration and cooperation within the cultural and creative sector. And also there has to be the balance in the flow of cultural goods and services. And the third goal is the integrate culture and sustainable development frameworks. So the national development plans has to be based on the equity in this distribution of and access to cultural resources. And the international development frameworks support the emergence of dynamic creative sectors in developing countries. And also the technical and financial assistance might be provided in order to strengthen human and institutional capacities and support creativity in developing countries. And the fourth goal is concerning the promote human rights and fundamental freedoms, and especially the gender equality and artistic freedom. So these are also very concerning issues across the globe in the sphere of public and culture and creative sector. So, so these are the main 4 goals of the 2005 UNESCO 2005 Convention, and within the 4, the main principle and the guiding principles. So there has these areas of monitoring, and in every 4 years, the UNESCO 2005 Convention published its global reports. So the recent one has to be published within this year, but because of the COVID, probably it might have it might be published in next year. So far we have 2 global reports, and then you can find out all the emerging new concepts and remaining challenges across the globe in the sphere of cultural and creative industries by reaching out to these pre-existing 2 global reports. And we're looking forward to the new global reports. So, and in the end, so I would like to outline also the main challenges and remaining challenges also for these future opportunities. So what is the main challenges in the concerning the cultural and creative industries? So is it a reinforcing one-dimensional or one-size-fits-all economistic language of culture and public policy, or a mutual collaboration understanding? Or volatile and hostile global political environment has created uncertain cultural policy landscape? And what does culture mean today, and what will mean in the future after systematic replacement by creative? So someone says also within the academia there's a concern about this post-cultural policy making. So the creativity and the creative economies is becoming the reinforcing the factor and concept within the cultural policy across the globe, and has the discourse of creative industry and economy since its inception in the late 90s sidelined and marginalized the social character of culture and its intrinsic values. And also can transitional economies with insufficient socioeconomic infrastructures and limited market access can catch up with the West and the rest? So that's also one of the remaining question mark for the transitional economies. And can creative economy lead transitional economies to growth and innovation as it promised? And both art and ordinary culture have become pervaded by the commercial logic. So how this commercial logic or economic nature of the culture has played out in these transitional economies. And also I would like to mention about the national, regional, and geopolitical, if you like, the cultural policy landscapes. So whether these, creative economy imaginary, which has popularized the creative industry economy, is an enabler of economic growth and social development, continue to act as a pertinent policy synchronization amongst non-Western societies and transitional economies in our case, amidst increasing global trade tensions and the multipolar world order in the making. So also this is the question mark for the foreseeable future. And also whether the global fast policy trend in concerning the creative economy promoted by the UNESCO 2005 Convention and the Creative Economy Initiatives by British Council to many transitional economies or developing countries through the adoption of the creative economy agenda can deliver its expected results in the future. So that's also a very open question for the foreseeable future, I think. And also whether the developing countries or transitional economies can catch up with the West and the rest. So can they integrate into this highly globalized cultural economy? And what might be other policy implications and political agendas, such as public diplomacy, soft power, and national building strategies? So at least in Mongolian case, maybe it might be the same in other transition economies. So the cultural and creative economy discourse and the UNESCO 2005 Convention has played a very crucial and guiding sort of role and principle, and that document in the national cultural policy reforms. And these are the remaining challenges that I think which is still exist in the transitional economies, and I would like to, and I'm based on my experience from Mongolia. So these are the weak copyright or protection, or the constitutional issues concerning the international properties, and also lack of infrastructure in the cultural sphere and insufficient public funding. And also we facing with this limited human capital and restricted market access, and also lack of political and technical leadership, and also disconnection between policymakers and the creative community, and the rise of the precarious work in the cultural sector, and no provision on gender equality. And I think gender equality is also one of the pressing ideas and challenges in the region. And also there's disparities between urban and rural areas, and rapid commercialization and commodification of culture in these transitional economies, and its obsolete or outdated arts and cultural education system. Or if you like, we can broaden this issue into a more general, the cultural and arts ecosystem. I would like to broaden. And these are also the future opportunities for Central Asia and the South Caucasus, and including Mongolia as the transitional economy. So around half of the population is under 30 years old in Central Asian region especially, so which might bring the dynamism, progress, and more importantly, hope in the future. And also this can create alternative narratives of cultural and creative industry models different from the pre-existing ones. And also there's the growing ambition and confidence among these developing countries in Asia, and also in transitional economies in Central Asia and South Caucasus, to lead the creative and cultural development agenda. And also all these transitional economies are very proud of its rich culture and resilient history. So this is the end of my presentation. So thank you for paying attention.
Thank you very much, Majer, because indeed it was very interesting, not only from the point of view of the development of creative industries, but also from the point of view of the work of UNESCO in this area, and in the forming of the principles that were the basis of the 2005 UNESCO Convention in terms of cultural self-expression. And it was very interesting for us to hear the experience of Mongolia and to compare it with the situation in Central Asian countries, and to see how the creative industries are being developed in our region right now. I would like to remind the participants that you can forward your questions to the chat, or since we are not so many today, you can simply raise your hand and ask your questions live. And now I have already received the question from one of the participants, was Nick Elena K. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Could you please tell us a little bit more at greater lengths what the reports of UNESCO usually incorporate, and what is the basis of collecting information for them?
Right. So each state party would who ratified the convention, and in every 4 years the state parties has to, as an obligation, has to submit its own national periodic reports. We call it QPRs, quadrennial national periodic reports. So, and UNESCO, the secretariat and headquarters in Paris, and collect all these and the national reports, periodic reports from all these the state parties, and then in the end, as a result, and then they just release its global reports based on all the data and informations gathered from these state parties. So far we have, as I mentioned, 2 global reports. The first one was released back in 2016 and 12, if I'm not mistaken. So the next it has to come out, and it's going to be published within this year, 2020. So, and then these global, and you can generally, and then have a very general overview of the global sort of the trajectory or the development in culture, in the sphere of cultural and creative industries. So, and then within this, the reports, and you can find out the current challenging issues, and then within the film industry, the music industry. So also there's emerging new opportunities and emerging new policies. It might be in the music sector. So it's also very helpful, and also it's very useful guide for all the the countries to find out, to learn from these pre-existing the challenges and opportunities across the globe. So I would like to urge to, if you're interested in the sort of transnational cultural policy, so I would urge for those who interested in that kind of discourse, to read our 2 existing global reports published by the UNESCO, and the new upcoming one.
Majer, I would like also to add a few words as to the question of Elina concerning the way of such reports drafting. As Bodibaatar has already mentioned, he's a member of the international experts group who are working in various countries and who represent various sectors of creative and cultural economy and industry. And therefore, every expert has his or her own personal experience, and depending on the tasks that are put forth by the Secretariat of 2005 Convention, which is working in UNESCO, they usually attract experts, and they draft the content, and in principle, this is how various national reports are put together. The national reports are issued not so often. Some of them are issued once every 2 years, others on an annual basis. For example, last year there was a report dated 2020, was a report which was reacting to pandemic of COVID-19. And Majer, I believe that you do have a link. Please share it in the chat so that all our participants will be able to download it and to visit this link. It is also available on the global UNESCO site. And in the last 2020 report, they were provided some measures of how to react and how to resolve various problems or tasks that were typical for 2020. And some of the measures are pretty acceptable and very topical for our Central Asian countries. And I would like to reiterate again that in our region, only Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have ratified 2005 convention, even though in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, what we are observing is that for the last 8 months, we've been very actively having our trainings, discussions regarding the development and support of cultural and creative industries. And you are the member of many working groups, and you are participating in various chats, Elina, which are available on creative industries and creative economy. And I would like to take this opportunity and to ask 3 questions to Bodibaatar. The first question is as follows. Actually, all the questions are related to the situation in Mongolia. What about crafts and events show industry in Mongolia? Are they incorporated? Are they included into the list or into the focus of cultural and creative economy in Mongolia? So this is my first question. My second question is as follows. You have already had an experience of working in the Ministry of Culture of your country. So I would say that you were on the opposite side of the understanding of introduction and development of creative economy. From your point of view, if you are again in the shoes of the civil servant from the Ministry of Culture, from your point of view, how the civil servants from the ministry, how did they perceive this area of work, this field of work? What were the difficulties in their perception? Because, you know, the work of a civil servant, of a bureaucrat, and what actually happens in the public community, where the representatives of the creative and cultural industry actually work and operate are different. And you noted it very rightly in your presentation. And the third question, which is associated with the previous one, from your point of view, what are the problems, or how can we help our civil servants, our bureaucrats, what to do? I mean, for example, I'm talking about UNESCO Almaty. How can we help them, and what do we need to do, and what do the representatives of the cultural and creative industries should do to be able to find the common denominator, so to speak, and to start working on the development of creative industry and creative economy. Because, for example, in Kazakhstan, we have already started very actively working in this area, and there is an office which is drafting the concept of creative economy development. For example, in Almaty, we even established a department under the Akimat of Almaty. Akimat is the mayor of Almaty, and they established the department on creative industry. So there are some initiatives already available, but if you know the nature of this problem, if you know, let's say, the usual stance of the civil servants, what would you recommend us to do to overcome this barrier?
Thank you for the addition and contribution, and also for the questions. It's a very difficult and challenging and long question, so I'll try to, you know, just answer it in very. I try to just address the question based on my sort of own experience that I had back in Mongolia as a, as I told you, the boring bureaucrat, I would like to call. So, and as I, briefly, explained in my presentation that, so I started working for the ministry. I mean, before the ministry, I was recruited by the governmental agency it was the governmental implementation agency. So it was back in 2009, so right after my graduation from the Ankara University. So at that time, I had no idea about this. I heard these, the cultural and creative industries and so forth, but it was very superficial and so I had no idea about it. And I didn't know about this, the historical context and, the conceptual ideas behind the policies and so forth. So that's how I, involved in these cultural and creative industries and in this policy discourse in the late 2000s, I would say. And Mongolia was just, a few years before ratified the convention in 2007. And UNESCO still is playing a very crucial role in reshaping the national cultural policy reform in Mongolia, because so far we don't have the British Council. We do have the Alliance Française and Goethe and other international aid, organizations, and but we do not have the British Council. So, but also the British Council is also one of the major and then the main international aid organization to lead the leading international organization to promote the idea of creative industries and creative economy, especially in the context of Central Asia that I noticed. And then in most of the, as you already mentioned, that there are just only 2 countries ratified from the Central Asia, and then but the British Council is promoting, and then all these, the entrepreneurship and the creative economies in in the region. So that's the kind of difference. So UNESCO was the leading kind of the actor or agent in Mongolian case. So that's how I involved in the late 2000s. And yeah, as I mentioned, so I had no, a very, very limited kind of idea about the cultural and creative industries, and especially in the ministry in all level, from it was very new and brand new kind of idea so we just kind of tried to, and it's not only the case in Mongolia, even it was very interesting, and even to some extent funny that even in South Korea, for instance, we always kind of imagine that South Korea is one of the leading and powerhouse in the global kind of cultural and creative industries. So we always imagine and always have a kind of idea about these South Koreans has this, they have very good knowledge about this, this discourse and so forth. But it was very surprising when we visited in around 2015 or 16 in South Korea, and then even within these, people who, the prepared and wrote the draft of the national reports were debating about the notion of diversity, the diversity, cultural diversity. So there was a lot of confusion and misconception and within these the policymakers and academics and cultural practitioners, even though even in that kind of developed East Asian tiger countries with the industrialized countries. So in Mongolian case, it was very new idea. So it was, we would just try to, and I think there were just various types of the capacity building activities and projects implemented in Mongolia. So we had various types of different international experts who came to Mongolia and held these different sort of consultation meetings with all the relevant stakeholders, not only from the the minister or the senior level policymakers from the Ministry of Culture, also from we tried to bring all these the ministerial the different ministerial people from different ministries, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and so forth. So it was a kind of challenging in the initial phase, I would say, in the late 2000s. But now, and then over the last more than a decade or so at least there's an consensus has been built among all the relevant stakeholders, from the members of the civil society, and also from the the public officials and civil servants from the ministry. There's still a remaining challenge in terms of the ministerial cooperation or misconception, misunderstanding. But at least we break some sort of we made big breakthrough to to disseminate this agenda into our the national development. So also these cultural and creative economy and industries, and these ideas and concepts also integrated into national development policies in our new the national vision for 2050 and so forth. So, and also we have very good and vibrant the civil society environment in Mongolia. So also we have very good relationship with this the other, especially I've involved in the latest preparation for the QPR in 2019. So I tried to bring all these the people from these various civil society organizations in the preparation for the national reports. So we have very kind of we made some sort of very good kind of relationship with this relevant with all the relevant stakeholders, and so far it's going pretty well, I would say. So this is maybe it's specifically very unique to Mongolian, but I'm not sure about the what about the rest of the transitional economies. But also there is also still misconception and some misunderstanding among the ministerial level. So we try to involve the ministry from because by nature the policy and concept requires different, the collaboration with different ministries. So, but still there is some misunderstanding and misconception from the different, part of the, for instance, some people would say why culture has to be, within these economic policies. So there are still, that sort of debates and discussions is taking place at that governmental level, at least I would say. And also I think there's well, I mean, we've been in this new kind of political economic system over the last more than three decades, right? So from the 90s. I think it's because of also these generational changes. So we now have these new politicians from the new generation, I would say. So now we have new prime minister who's more or less with my age, same age, in the early 40s. And also we've just appointed a new cultural minister also from, from my generation. So we have this new kind of, the decision makers, opinion makers, and these, young kind of, politicians and, policy makers and cultural practitioners and artists and civil society members. So it also brings these, as I mentioned, indicated in my, last chapter of my webinar. So it also brings some kind of, the hope or kind of, energy in this, the policy making sphere, I would say. Yeah. So and also I think so, and there's a consensus among these new kind of new political elite, I would maybe I might call, and say that they are just agreed upon. There's a consensus that we have to integrate into this global kind of cultural and creative industries, and then every policies that we are pursuing also involve this cultural and creative sector. Yeah. So this is the some of the basic development which is taking place in Mongolia. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, so that was also very, I think it was not only the misconception or misunderstanding from Mongolian end, but it was also very, I still remember the first, the experience that I got with UNESCO in these cultural and creative industries in relation to the 2005 convention was started in 2008. So there was a first, so far we have 2 or 3 phases of these projects, capacity building projects, funded and initiated by UNESCO and funded by the Career Trust Fund. And the first project, it was not only the case in Mongolia, also quite previously, recently I learned that from Vietnam and then in most of the cases in Asia that in early and late, 2009 and in 2010 and so forth, these countries somehow, integrated the crafts and handicrafts within the cultural and creative industries. So, and then still in Mongolian case, also the first project was specifically focused on crafts. And I still remember because I involved in that, I was the main, the coordinator for that project. So we invited 2, the craft sort of the experts from Malaysia and Southeast Asia. So the crafts was also one of the main component within the definition of cultural and creative industries in the early phase of the projects. But eventually, now it's evolved into this. Now we just, we have this definition of cultural and creative industries in our policy, national policy, the documents and so forth. But now it's more evolved from the crafts into the cultural creative industries, more arts sectors, I would say. So there was this kind of shared or kind of common misunderstanding, not only in Mongolia, but even in other Asian countries, and also the UNESCO, the regional offices, especially the Beijing office, also they were just promoting the crafts, involving in these cultural and creative industries related projects. Yeah. So and now there is a consensus that we have to more, include the art sector and emerging new the creative sectors, including the fashion, design, and advertisement and IT sectors. So now we're just trying to follow these sort of these Western kind of concepts, mostly related on arts and creative, new emerging creative sectors. Yes.
Thank you very much. And there is one more question in the chat with regard to the presentation. Yes, the presentation is going to be distributed among all the registered participants, but for this I will probably request our lecturer, our presenter, to send to us the updated version of your lecture, because I've noticed that you had 2 or more additional slides. And Florian, I would like to ask a question. The only problem is that we have only 5 minutes before the end of our webinar. Therefore, please try to make your question very short.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm agree with your, your comment on this, the music industry and music scene, I would say, all alternative and all rock, and it's very vibrant. And I'm not, familiar with this, the case and what is the music scene and the vibrant scene in Kyrgyzstan, but at least in Mongolia's music, industry is one of the leading industry in terms of its quality and economic input and its reputation. So as you might know, so for instance, over the last few years, we have this new phenomenon, which is called there's not a lot of things happening in the music industry, people trying to bring the cultural and our own sort of Mongolian traditional music, trying to merge it with this kind of new and then digital, and it's also became viral in digital platforms and on YouTube and so forth. So we have this phenomena of, these we have this one group which is called the Who, and it became, this very kind of global phenomenon. So I think it's very common kind of phenomenon in overall in Central Asia, because the region itself, it has a very rich, musical and cultural heritage and then tradition, I would say. So then the new, generation has, they pay a lot of attention and then trying to dig out all these, these hidden gems, I would say, and then trying to use these, all these various kind of mediums, especially using these digital mediums and so forth. And then they're just very good at marketizing and then just creating new kind of sounds and new kind of narratives within this global cultural economy. And second, your second was, yeah, that's also very, I mean, that's in the as you mentioned, the cultural or creative labor, and then precarious cultural and creative labor. It's also one of the very pressing issue across the globe, especially, and then and there's a, especially, I mean, within the academia, and then there's a lot of, you know, the sociological analysis and then works and have done on these, you know, the cultural and the precarious cultural and creative labor, but there's very few, almost none is done on these, you know, the developing countries or transitional countries, economies, so forth. And it is also very crucial and then very pressing issue in Mongolia. So always, mostly in these transition economies or in developing countries, the economic aspect or economic, you know, the side of the cultural and creative industries is mostly emphasized and embraced, and then to some extent, you know, glorified by the people and the practitioners themselves or the policymakers. But the social aspect, especially the social status of the artists and the musicians or the cultural practitioners, and also in the just, you know, social security and economic security is also very crucial. And there's also the inequality within the system, and economic inequality also in the cultural sector. So that's also one of the, I think that's the main, it might be the main challenge for the foreseeable future. And if you look at all these, you know, the global reports and everything, there's a lot of things about these, you know, the social impacts, and then sort of the social impacts and social status of artists, and gender issues, diversities, and so forth. And at the same time, this economic contribution to the GDPs and so forth. Well, there are very less things and I've said on this, you know, the social and then economical status of the artists, which, but then if you look at the academical, you know, all these papers and then the working papers, there are a lot of, you know, the concerns, the emerging from this, especially sociology concerning the culture and creative. So that's the main, one of the biggest issues, not only in the region and then in the Central Asia, but it's going to be a very global and issue for the foreseeable future, I think, that we have to address.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time of our webinar is almost up. Therefore, we will wind up our work. Thank you very much to our participants. Thanks a lot to our distinguished speaker, who actually delivered a very interesting presentation, which I trust will be very interesting for many of our participants and professionals in the area of culture who did not manage to join our today's webinar, but they will be able to watch it in recording. Unfortunately, I will not be able to announce the webinars, the follow-up webinars on the cultural industry, and we are negotiating right now, and you will get the news in our social media. If Bodibaatar would like to say a few concluding words, I would like to turn the floor to him, and on my behalf, I would like to thank everybody and see you again soon.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my experience, and then it's my privilege to be part of this in ongoing series of talks which is taking place in Central Asia. So I'm also very interested in the recent development in culture in Central Asia. So I hope after the post-COVID period, I would like to physically visit the Central Asia and to witness and be engaged and be part of this ongoing development, I would say. And thank you.